What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a damning expose about how the world inside video game publishing and developing is dying. Which, as a loose translation, means I'm going to talk for a while about something I've just kind of noticed in general with games more and more. And while it's not a new concept by any means, it's just something that, thanks in no small part to the ongoing Fallout TV show Season 2, kind of reminded me of and just felt like something I wanted to talk about. So here we are. And that obviously is kind of the fracturing of fan bases for long-standing franchises and much of anything that goes on for a significant period of time in the gaming world, because, as you'll notice more and more, the fan bases of those individual things tend to fracture off into different groups. Usually some variation of, we liked the old version of this, the new version sucks, and then there's people who like the new version who didn't like the old stuff. That's a very common one, but sometimes it gets even more specific than that, focusing in on particular things about individual properties each entry into the series may or may not have. And I think there's a few different reasons for this. Some are obvious. Different groups of people working on evolving standards for an individual franchise are certainly contributing factors. The genres of the games themselves changing even, so there's a variety of different reasons. But whatever those reasons happen to be, to my mind, this is one of the things that actually steps in and puts a sort of cap on whatever long-standing franchise may be a thing, and then eventually allows for new things to emerge. And while I, truth be told, have no solutions for any of this outside of what works for me personally, which I suppose I'll talk a bit about at the end, but really I just wanted to talk about it more as an observer because, as somebody who reviews a lot of games, the thing that, in my opinion, tends to kill these franchises is this. And to some degree, I also think it's kind of unavoidable at the same time, which is another interesting sort of side conversation to the whole thing. But kind of narrowing in on some of the causes of this, there's a great video from Fallout creator Tim Kaine on the concept of lore drift, as he puts it, which is a really great perspective on something I want to talk about as somebody outside of the actual process of making video games. But I wanted to reference Tim Kaine's video on the thing, mostly because I'm going to be mentioning Fallout a little bit here, but also just because I think it's a really interesting watch and to offer a different perspective on this, just from a different angle, I suppose. But I suppose you could sum up the concept by simply saying that over time things change. Now that can mean a few different things. As a franchise continues, I think at some point you have to either add new stuff or the games are going to get stale, and that's going to be its own separate problem. But in the addition of new things, you are inevitably going to upset someone. Something that I think being on the internet in any sort of creative capacity for any length of time will eventually teach you is that if something exists, someone has a problem with it. It doesn't matter how beloved or benign you think that is, I promise you somebody hates it. But in the context of what we're talking about here, sometimes this just comes from a place of you changed the thing that I enjoy, and now I am upset about that, and this is the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. But even beyond that, for especially old franchises, which this tends to happen with, there's also, let's just be real, some turnover in the developers. Now, I have worked at plenty of places where turnover has been high. Back when I worked my normal jobs before doing YouTube full-time, one of the places I worked, I was on third shift, actually, and from the time I started that job to a few years later when I left it, only 3 other people that were there when I started were still there when I left. And given that video games are an industry with all sorts of, just lately, layoffs and the like, it is just not uncommon for teams to change, and that is inevitably going to mean that the people who are working on something now are not the people who worked on it originally. Now, personally, that's fine with me, as I think the idea that the exact same group of people are going to make the thing you enjoy for the rest of your life is, nonsensical on the face of it. You do see the argument thrown around online that, it's not even the same group of people anymore and that kind of thing, but it's I don't really know what you expected. That is how all of life works, I'm afraid, but regardless of, how it happens, over time things change, and this means that the thing you enjoyed about a given franchise might not be the thing it is focused on anymore. There are multiple examples of this. The Elder Scrolls series is an easy one. People don't like how the things have gotten more streamlined and more action-oriented RPG type of situations, more so than the deeper RPGs previously. As I mentioned, Fallout a couple of times, you have a lot of people who really love the isometric CRPGs and are still real mad about the switch to 3D open world RPG even. But even within that context, you have people who like how they did things in New Vegas and think New Vegas is the best entry and every other one sucks. Now that Fallout has become media beyond just video games with the TV show, I've seen non-stop discourse since the start of Season 2 about how people don't like what they did with the TV show in regards to New Vegas, and that's before the season is even concluded. We don't even have hard answers to those things yet. But my point being, you can see this everywhere, especially once you notice it. It happens all the time. And then for a sort of side conversation to this, something else that can kind of trigger that is a change in genre, as I mentioned there with Fallout. Another great example of this is actually the Dragon Age series. Every single one of those games is way different than all of the other games in the franchise, and that led to a lot of people liking all the different games, and they never really had a cohesive fan base as a result. But that is actually especially interesting to me because, especially in the CRPG space, which I am a little more known for, something that you see a lot actually, like enough for it to be measurable even, is that a franchise will start out as an isometric CRPG, get popular, and then suddenly try to switch genre to try to get that IP out to more people. But in reaching more people, you're then on a bit of a tightrope because you've probably upset at least a few people who wanted it to keep that same genre, and if you don't reach enough people with the new thing you're trying to do, well, you may well have just killed the IP, actually. Not every gaming series survives that jump. Which leads me to the other aspect of what I wanted to talk about here. This is, I think, to a degree, a sort of inevitable phenomenon in the sense that it's a tightrope that the devs and the companies making these games are ultimately walking, and while I don't mean that in a way that like, oh, we should give them some grace, etc., at the end of the day, the game's good, people enjoy playing it, or it's not, and they don't. But that doesn't really change the fact that these are also companies out to make money, and that's how they exist, and so what they're going to try to do is to reach new heights with all of this stuff. Because on the exact flip side of that conversation, if they keep things exactly the same and only iterate a tiny little bit between each entry, and that series continues to cost more and more to make, but also doesn't reach a new audience and get more people involved, then those games aren't going to make enough to be financially viable anymore, and they will stop getting made. So, of course, these companies and developers are going to be trying to make money, and the way you do that, and sometimes that works out and sometimes it does not. But I mentioned towards the top of the video that I think this is one of the ways that big franchises tend to die, because in my experience at least, while this is not obviously universally the case, what tends to happen is that these franchises have a sort of peak, and then as time goes on, the fan base continues to fracture and gets more and more upset with the product as time goes on. This results in any subsequent entry into that series then being met with, I would say, often competing groups of people and fans who want entirely different things from the product that is being put out. And this then leads to the online back and forth between people who really like the old thing versus the people who really like the new thing, etc., etc. And I think ultimately you get to a situation where eventually the whole thing just kind of starts to break down because either nobody's happy or there just simply aren't enough people to sustain the growth of the thing, and so it starts to fail to meet sales targets, etc., and then they eventually just shelf the whole thing until maybe 20 years from now when they try to do a reboot or the like. And long term, I think, over the course of potentially decades even, it becomes this sort of vicious cycle where you have new interesting thing, it blows up, gets big, they start doing more and more with it, expanding all the different things it's into, the fan base fractures, eventually that thing is no longer financially as successful as they need it to be to continue it, thing stops getting made, etc. And as I also mentioned towards the top of the video, I don't really have like a solution to this or anything. I think it's just the natural consequence of people being people, really. You don't like the change, you decide to voice that, as you obviously have every right to, and then the cycle persists, and with any luck, you get some new stuff along the way that is probably also going to follow that cycle to some degree. And I suppose there's an argument to be made there to just like get out while the getting's good, you know? Not everything needs to persist for forever, which is actually another aspect of this. This is something you see with longer running franchises, specifically because they are longer running. If you make a couple of great games and go, that was awesome, and then just don't make any more, there's nothing to fracture there, really. So it just kind of all stays in one place with people just wishing there had been more of the thing. And I do think it is very valid to say that, you know, not everything should go on forever, no matter how much we enjoy it. And in fact, I think you'll find out the hard way eventually that life is going to enforce that on you at some point. Which brings me around to every YouTuber's favorite subject, myself. This is just not the kind of thing that, I don't know, really bothers me anymore at this point. I think there was a time in my life where, you know, watching the thing I really love change, stuff like that, and, you know, eventually become less in my eyes would have bothered me more. Simply a combination of age, but also just kind of putting some distance between myself and the emotions that I attach to video games has helped me here with just going to find and play other things and experience different stuff altogether. Even the franchises that I really, really love, like Divinity or Pillars of Eternity as an example, I do not get so caught up in those that them changing anything, or even if something is underwhelming, etc., is going to be like personally offensive to me. I'm going to be fine. At most, I'm going to go, well, that sucks, and then move on to whatever else I plan on playing next. So while it's not really a solution to the problem, me personally, I just don't let this bother me anymore. And I'm certainly not going to argue about it. Like, for instance, again, with the Fallout TV show, I see a lot of the online arguments about one aspect of it or another, but I just am not going to get involved in that. I watch it, you know, feel how I feel about it, and then that's pretty much the end of it. But, you know, then again, I'm a guy who spends, like, the vast majority of his time working in his own house and not really going out and talking with people at any great length in person, mind you, and so there is something to be said of the sort of more community-oriented aspect of talking through and sharing the things you enjoy with other people. And I certainly do a little bit of that with my own family as an example, but I mean, I just don't really care what anybody else on the internet has to say about it. But, you know, random people on the internet's opinion on the subject is not terribly interesting to me. But yeah, all told, I think this kind of thing really is just the natural cycle of media in general, and at least speaking entirely for myself on this one, simply knowing that kind of just makes it easier to deal with for me. It's just kind of the way things go, if you will. And to that end, while, you know, obviously I don't like seeing something I really enjoy get turned into something I do not enjoy as much as the next person, I'm happy to at least have gotten to a point where it doesn't like ruin my day or anything. But because of all the different factors at play and how everything kind of twists, winds, and works itself out, unfortunately this is the kind of thing that I just don't think is ever going to change in any meaningful way. And on that delightfully cheery note, I think that's where I'm going to end this particular video. So hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about all this down in the comment section below, though I would be willing to bet at least a few of you already have. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.